Hello and welcome from Buenos Aires, Argentina to this episode of Crossing Borders with Nathan Lustig, where Nata's conversations with entrepreneurs doing business across borders and the people who support them, with a focus on those that have some connection to Latin America. My name is Josefina Dominguez and I am an editor for Latinlist, a proud sponsor of the Crossing Borders podcast. Sign up for our weekly updates on latinlist.com to get a summary of the week's biggest headlines in Latin American tech news. Nate's guest today is Bismarck Lepe, President and CEO at Wizeline, a global product development company that helps its clients solve their biggest challenges with design and technology. Bismarck was also the founding CEO of Ooyala, and before that was a senior product manager at Google. In this episode, they talk about Bismarck's nomadic childhood between the US and Jalisco in Mexico, and how he veered from wanting to study medicine to taking an interest in tech startups and eventually founding one himself. They also discuss the harsh truths about what it takes to be a successful entrepreneur and how Guadalajara's tech ecosystem has evolved over the years. We hope you enjoy this conversation with Bismarck Lepe.
Hey Bismarck, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being willing to do it.
Thanks. We should have done this on Clubhouse.
Yeah, we probably should have. Where are you in the world today?
I'm in Tiburon, California. And for those who aren't familiar with Tiburon, it's kind of the northern end of the Silicon Valley, just over the Golden Gate Bridge by San Francisco.
And tell me a little bit about what you're working on.
Wizeline continues to be our priority. 2020 was a really good year. We more than doubled in size. We're over 1,000 people, and it was a bit of a roller coaster. You know, we started the year thinking that it was going to be phenomenal, and then COVID hit, and we focused on taking care of our people, and demand slowed down a little bit for a few weeks, but then it just came back, and we ended up beating our operating plan, if you can imagine that. And one of the really cool things about the business that we're in, technology services, is that you do get to see a lot of technical problems that companies are looking to solve. And last summer, one of our customers came to us with a security authentication problem, and they're like, "Hey, can Wizeline build this for us?" And we looked at it like, you know what? This looks like a company more than just a product for a single company. And so I asked my brother, I'm like, "Hey, are you interested in starting your own company?" And he said, "You know what? Ooyala was great. Let's do it again." So we started a security company called Serbi, and they're off to the races. We raised $3.5 million last summer, and they should be launching their product soon. And now another opportunity came to us, and we're working on that and see if we can also launch that business. But Wizeline, continues to be the priority. We want to get it as big as possible, and maybe by 2022 be in a position to be able to take it public.
And Wizeline is an interesting company because it has operations in many, many different countries, including Mexico as one of the main ones. Why? What's the vision around that? Why multiple countries, and why Mexico specifically?
Well, when the company started in 2014, we originally set it up to build a SaaS platform to help companies prioritize features, because we found that the vast majority of software development went to waste. 60 and 90% went into features that weren't used, weren't sold, or were never completed. And we just thought that there was an algorithmic way to be able to do that more efficiently. But after a couple of years, we realized that one of the biggest problems that companies had was getting the right talent and getting that talent to build the right products. And so we expanded into services, and now that's become the primary way of working. And as the world has moved away from waterfall to agile, the outsourced product development industry now requires that your engineering teams not be on the other side of the world, but be in the same time zones that you work in. And so our biggest market continues to be the US, broadening now to all of the Americas. And so given that, being within the same time zones and being in Mexico makes sense for the Americas being in the European time zones makes sense for our European customers, and obviously for our APAC customers, being in APAC makes a lot of sense.
So we'll dig a little more into the businesses in a bit here, but I wanted to talk about your backstory and your journey to become a founder. Where are you from originally?
I was born in Southern California, but the first 7 years we were kind of nomads. My parents were migrant field workers. They're originally from Mexico, and we would live between Jalisco, central Mexico, Southern California, Central California, all the way up to Washington State, where they picked apples, and then back down California, and then to Jalisco every year. And so we would be traveling for about 7 to 8 months out of the year, which meant that between 4 and 5 months out of the year, we would spend it in Mexico.
And what was that like as a kid growing up?
I think kids are highly adaptable. I thought it was great. I got to hang out with my parents while they were picking apples in the fields. Like, I got to run around in the fields. I do remember though, when we were in the Central Valley, we would get up at 5 a.m. And we'd go out to the fields to pick peaches, and it was so brutally cold that I couldn't wait for it to warm up. But by the time it got to noon, it was like 105 degrees. I couldn't wait for it to cool down again. That was like the perpetual cycle every day.
And from when you decided, or when your family ended up stopping the movement, how did your life change, and how did you end up going on this entrepreneurial journey?
Well, my parents always felt that education was important, and that's the main reason that we settled down in Southern California. They wanted to make sure that I would be settled and go to one school and have friends and get good grades and so on and so forth. From an entrepreneurial perspective, my parents weren't entrepreneurs, but my grandparents on my mother's side and many of my uncles on my mother's side are entrepreneurs. Even my dad's side are entrepreneurs. And so I always had this idea that starting a company was how you build wealth. And if I think about it, I learned to speak English by watching Sesame Street, obviously, Mr. Rogers, obviously, but also Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous and the old drama Dallas. And in both Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous and Dallas, entrepreneurship is how they built their wealth. And so I think that was ingrained very early on. And so I always had little businesses. In second grade, I had a little stationery shop. By the time we got to junior high, I had a little software business. And once I realized that technology was advancing so quickly that I shouldn't continue to program, this was probably like 92, which was obviously a really big mistake, given that was actually the beginning of the software boom. I was going to become a doctor, and then I got to Silicon Valley in 98, kind of brought it all back. And I ended up working in a bunch of different startups while I was also trying to start my own companies.
And you mentioned Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous in Dallas and the stories around entrepreneurship. And we've had multiple guests on the podcast talk about the importance of science fiction and also stories for Latin America. How do you see that? Do you think that is an issue, that there should be more stories in Latin America on Netflix or on TV that maybe talk about building businesses and being an entrepreneur? Do you think that's an important piece of why maybe the US has had lots of entrepreneurs going forward?
Yeah, I think if you've seen it before, you have a model that you can follow, and it becomes much easier. Being the first is always hardest. You take a lot of the early punches, and it's usually the fast followers that end up doing better than the initial pioneers. When we started Ooyala, which was a video platform company that we founded in 2007 with my brother and a good friend from college who was also working at Google, we ended up opening operations in Guadalajara in 2010, and it was difficult to attract talent because everybody wanted to work at Oracle, HP, IBM, because there was this idea of going and working for a big brand. But things like the movie The Social Network, and even Steve Jobs's death, that just kind of brought back his story of how he started Apple or co-founded Apple, and was kicked out and then came back. I think all of those stories really inspire kind of that next generation of talent, and now all these homegrown unicorns are really showing other budding entrepreneurs that it is possible and that they can succeed.
So talk a little bit about the journey from medicine to working in startups to starting your own. How did you decide to pull the trigger on starting your own business, and why video?
So going back to identifying a model that works, the most successful person that I knew was my uncle, and he's a doctor who has a small hospital in Manzanillo, and his kids, who are my cousins, they're a little bit older than me, always had the best toys, and they had a nice house, and they lived really well. And so I'm like, okay, so I'm gonna go do exactly what my uncle is doing, in which he was an orthopedic surgeon who got into business. And then, I get to Stanford in 1998. That summer, broadcast.com had just gone public, and the following year, Yahoo would buy it for like $6 billion. And I saw all of these 22, 23-year-olds driving NSXs and Porsche Turbos. I'm like, well, I don't think they're doctors. And, being Mexican, the other thing that you think about is, and I don't think that they're narcotraficantes. So what could they be? And I really, I dug in a little bit, and they were all paper millionaires working at all these startups. And so I changed course and started studying computer science and economics. But really where I spent most of my time was working at different startups. And it was by working that I built up my network, and I learned a lot. And, between on the weekends, whenever I could find some spare time, I also tried to start a few companies. They all failed. They never really got to anything. And it wasn't until I got to Google that I got to see true scale. While I was there, we went from a couple hundred people to over 10,000 in 4.5 years. And it was after that I realized, okay, so this is how you scale a business. And we identified a big opportunity in kind of this transition from linear TV to over the top.
And what happened with the business?
With that company that we started?
Yeah.
So we founded the company April of 2007. It was actually pretty easy to raise capital. We were the first group of entrepreneurs that had left Google. And so everybody felt like we had some pixie dust and we could make whatever we would touch successful. And to be honest, we were also a little bit arrogant having come out of Google, and we just thought we could do everything. I think at some point I was quoted like in the Wall Street Journal saying that we would be bigger than Google. We obviously didn't become bigger than Google, but we were able to raise several rounds of capital, and eventually we sold the business to Telstra, which is an Australian telco, for $410 million, which was a good exit for the investors, good exit for the entrepreneurs, and the executives and some of the employees.
What were the biggest couple of lessons learned from that entire process of starting, building, scaling, and then selling a business?
There are a bunch. I would say that one of the biggest learnings for me was ask for help and ask for advice. I felt like since I was the CEO and I had raised capital from our investors, that I needed to have all the answers, and that I needed to guide the ship correctly, and that it was my sole responsibility. And that's usually what I tell entrepreneurs, especially with LinkedIn. It's so easy to go and find several dozen people who are at exactly the same point that you may be at, and in terms of a challenging situation, or have lived and gone through those points. and raising your hand, reaching out, and just asking for help, you'll find that more often than not, you'll find a compassionate ear and someone very empathetic who will be willing to listen and provide their thoughts on how they would approach a situation. So I would say that first and foremost, it would be that. Secondly, it's knowing how to manage your investors and your board, and when to push back. Again, early on when I had raised our seed round, I felt as though I owed everything to the investors, and I treated their money as a ticket for me to have to consider everything that they said as gospel. But the reality is, as investors, and especially board members who are really busy, they don't think about your business day in, day out. Yeah, they do have experience, but they don't have all of the data because they're not seeing all the data come in. And so it's important to listen to them, but you as an entrepreneur shouldn't do exactly what they say.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we always say it's just as bad if you never listen to your investor, or you always listen to your investor. Both of those are equally bad.
Exactly. They're not there, and the right investors know that their place is not to operate the business, or else they would be operators.
Yep. No, that's really good advice. And when you've been in Latin America, looking at tech companies and meeting entrepreneurs, boards and advisors in LATAM, I think, is even more complicated than in the US now. What advice would you give to LATAM or Mexican founders that maybe are dealing with early boards, or investors that do want to get more involved than probably they should be getting?
Oh, well, I think it's important to get, if the majority of the existing board members are all from Latin America, who only have experience working at traditional businesses, expand the board and bring in people who have actually worked on digital businesses before and have seen the scale, and have seen the opportunities and have run into the issues that the entrepreneur is going to be running into. Because someone that's run the biggest bottling plant for Pepsi across Latin America has probably very little experience for someone that's creating a new SaaS platform for diapers.
Yeah, that makes good sense. So after you exited the business, what did you do next? Did you take any time off, or did you jump right into the next idea?
Well, it was interesting, the timing. So at the beginning of 2012, we raised a venture round of capital from Telstra Ventures, and they were a strategic investor. They wanted us to help them build value on top of the pipes that they own across Australia. And so they didn't just want to own the pipes; they wanted to build the applications that were of higher value that ran on their pipes. And so they felt that an investment in Ooyala was a good way for them to be able to maximize that. And then at the beginning of 2013, they approached us and they said that they were going to do a JV with another very large company. And we started throwing around numbers of, Ooyala potentially being acquired for $1 billion, and then taking another $1 billion to roll up the rest of the industry. That deal fell through, but by then I had already decided that I was going to leave and go start my next thing. Eventually, a deal was done with just Telstra without this other partner, and so the company was sold, and it officially exited in 2014. I was already out starting Wizeline. And the original idea behind Wizeline was to help companies get better products to market faster, and solve a big problem that I had at both Google and Ooyala, which was as companies grow, the product teams and the product strategy gets pulled in 1,000 different directions. And what you end up investing in isn't necessarily what the market wants, but instead what the loudest person in the room may want.
And what was it like starting the next company after a big success?
Well, raising capital was much easier. We raised a seed round very quickly in a couple of weeks. I actually wrote the term sheet. Man, I remember I was talking to an investor and they're like, "So who's leading it?" I'm like, "Well, no one's really leading it. Here are the terms. If you want to invest, you can invest." They're like, "But no, but who's the lead investor?" I'm like, "Well, the biggest check is this investor, but there's no board seat, and if you want to invest, you can invest." But at the same time, at Ooyala, I think in trying to conserve cash, I was penny wise and pound foolish. I didn't hire a head of sales when I needed to hire a head of sales. I didn't hire a head of marketing when I needed to hire a head of marketing. I didn't hire a head of product, and I just felt like I could and I should do all of those roles. We were skimping on HR, and so we just wrote HR on the side of a Kleenex box, right? And there are certain things where I probably should have invested more than I did. And at Wizeline, we had the exit with Ooyala. We had raised capital pretty easily, and I think I hired a little too fast in some of these roles that are key to get to true product market fit. So I hired a head of sales and I brought in a head of product. And as the entrepreneur, as the founder, I think that being the head of sales and the head of product until you get to product market fit is so important, because you just want to reduce the time to development from the feedback that you get as much as possible, so you can iterate as quickly as possible. And that was a mistake that we made. We eventually corrected it, and I got much closer to the customers again, and that's where we identified the opportunity to actually move into services. We found that was a much bigger market than the one that we were in, and one that we were uniquely positioned to be successful because of the great brand that we had built in Mexico.
Yeah, those feedback loops are so important. You can't outsource any of that at the beginning to other people on your team. And one of the biggest challenges we see in LATAM startups is those feedback loops can be many times slower, especially with first-time entrepreneurs in the region compared to Silicon Valley, where you might have feedback loops in days or sometimes a week, and that might be slow in Silicon Valley. And in Mexico or Colombia or Chile, you might have a feedback loop that could be months or even a year. And that's the competitive disadvantage that some of those companies have.
Well, I disagree there. I think that that's more of a cultural issue, because unless you have a market of 10 customers, then maybe, and you're selling a $10 million product or a $50 million product, it's a game of numbers. Just pick up the phone. In the early days of Ooyala, I used to make anywhere between 50 and 100 calls a day. And then eventually I started getting callbacks and emails, and then meetings started to happen. And at the front end of the pandemic here at Wizeline, because we didn't know what was going to happen, we basically just all got back onto our LinkedIn and started doing a ton of outreach. And last year, 60% of our growth came from completely new logos that came from a lot of that outreach work that we did. And so I would say that, Andy from Agave Labs, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He tells a story about one of his entrepreneurs who's sitting there just kind of waiting for the phone to ring, a product that they already had in market. And he's like, why don't you call the prospects? Like, oh, is that allowed? And he's like, of course it is. So the guy made a call and he got a meeting scheduled. He's like, oh, that's fantastic. We have a meeting for next week. And he's like, okay, now make another call and another call and another call. So I think that, I don't necessarily know if all of the entrepreneurs in Latin America truly understand what it takes to be successful, because they read about, the success stories on TechCrunch, and it looks so easy by the time these companies get to TechCrunch that you don't know the work that went into making those companies successful in the early days. And then you also don't know about all of those other companies that didn't make it to TechCrunch because they no longer exist, where the entrepreneurs worked really, really hard. Like, this is tough, and you need to put a shit ton of work. The reality is that if you're not losing either your friends, your family, or your health, like, you're probably doing something wrong.
Yeah, and the it's like the overnight success really is 5 years or 7 years. People see a company that, I mean, Clubhouse, you mentioned at the beginning, where it's the overnight success, but those entrepreneurs have been working on these ideas and audio and
Paul was my
storytelling for
class, at Stanford, and he had Highlight back in 2010, and it was kind of an overnight success, but then it flamed out, and it never really became a real business that got to $1 billion valuation like Clubhouse just got. So yeah, it takes time, and even the Slacks of the world, right? That he failed 3 times and got to 2 interesting companies.
So switching gears a little bit about things that take time. So when you first started doing Mexico, and you said it was hard to convince people to come work at a company that wasn't IBM or a big logo. Talk a little bit about the infrastructure work that you and the community in Guadalajara have done over the last 10 plus years to make it an interesting tech ecosystem, and how the ecosystem has evolved. Because the first time we met, I think you were the first person that I saw that a Silicon Valley entrepreneur that was also had a big chunk of their team in LATAM. You were the first kind of pioneer doing the cross-border to Mexico that at least I found. So what was that story like, and how has it evolved?
So it was 2009, and we hired this consultant, Mark Ellis, who's the CEO of a company called Liftoff now. We eventually hired him at Ooyala, but we had worked with him at Google. Really smart guy, very business minded and very analytical. And we asked him to come in and do research because we needed to identify a place where we could set up an R&D center outside of the Silicon Valley. And he looked at Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, South America, and he came back and he said, Mexico is really interesting. At the time, Mexico was graduating about 60,000 engineers a year. Obviously, proximity, both location-wise as well as cultural proximity. And he's like, I think we should look at it. And initially, I didn't really believe it, because my parents left Mexico for the reasons that Trump speaks about Mexico, or how Trump speaks about Mexico, that it's dangerous, it's corrupt, there's zero upward mobility. But we went on a recruiting trip, and of the 15 engineers that we interviewed, our CTO, Sean Knapp, who had 0 ties to Mexico, said, I want to hire 8. I want to take them back to the Silicon Valley. I'm like, no, we're not taking them back to the Silicon Valley. It looks like there's talent here. Let's invest. And we ended up getting Adalberto Flores, who's a very successful entrepreneur, who's running Quesky now, and his good friend who was also trying to start a company with him, Vidal Gonzalez, who's now the CTO and founder of Serbi, that security company that we mentioned earlier, to open the office. And through them, we started to get to know the tech ecosystem, and it was incredible. And if we look back at 2010, it felt like we wanted to do a lot, and we wanted to change the landscape. And as they say, you overestimate what you can accomplish in a year, but you underestimate what can be done in a decade. And it was a little disappointing in terms of the progress we would make year over year. Companies were a little slower to move. A lot of the tech talent was moving away from .NET and moving into cloud, but it always felt like it was going slower than it should. But now 10 years later, and there are over 100 venture funds just in Mexico. there are a handful of unicorns or unicorns in the making in Mexico. You're starting to see companies like Lyft and Etsy that are making kind of that same journey that we did at Ooyala and opening operations in Mexico. And the same thing is happening across Latin America. So it's really exciting to see. And I'm very, the good and the bad of Latin America. A lot of shit's broken. For most people, they would say like, yeah, we complain, the infrastructure's bad, there's corruption, the markets aren't as big. But I also think of that as an opportunity. Like the companies that have been in market for decades, that have had monopolies, if they haven't fixed it by now, they're not going to fix it in the future. So you have all of these companies that can come in and take all those inefficiencies and turn them into big businesses, which is really exciting.
Yeah, and I'd much rather be competing against a legacy bank or retailer that's been doing the same thing for 100+ years than compete against Bezos or Zuckerberg.
Yeah, I think I've told you this story. I tell this story to everyone, and you can see this on YouTube. But there's this great talk. Ted Turner was at Stanford Business School, and in one of his talks, he was saying that he had the idea for CNN for a decade. Like he had been thinking about it for a decade, but he didn't pull the trigger in that decade because he just assumed that ABC, NBC, CBS, all of these broadcasters that already had news desks and international correspondents, like they would just do it. Like this 24-hour news channel, they were better prepared and they were able to do it, but they weren't doing it. And then he's like, then I realized that these companies were run by dumbasses. I don't actually think he felt that the competition were dumbasses, but they just had people who were fat and happy and doing the things that they've always been doing and reaping the profits. And so if that's where you're at, it's much harder for you to affect change and make the changes that you need made, while a Facebook, an Amazon, potentially an Etsy, some of these modern telcos, they're still fairly new and they're evolving and they still have that mindset of capturing that next bit of opportunity.
If you could go back to when you first started your first company, knowing everything you know today, what advice would you give yourself?
So one of the first companies that I started was in construction tech. And I think it actually could have been successful. I think I just should have had more confidence in myself to see it through. It's all of the life is just a bunch of steps and stepping stones, and every experience gives you something else that you can build on. And the network that I was able to build at Google obviously facilitated Ooyala's success and has absolutely facilitated Wizeline's success. But I still feel like if I had a little more confidence in myself, the company was called JobBid, and it was basically taking the entire tender and bidding process for construction projects online. And this was like in 2000. I think eventually it could have become something interesting, but then I probably wouldn't have been able to go and work at Google, which was also a phenomenal experience.
Do you have any books, blogs, podcasts, or documentaries you like to recommend to people, whether about startups or just life in general?
So the ones that I listen to religiously, Pivot religiously, and then recently I've started listening to the All In podcast. But then I also really like Business Wars, which I feel like are mini business case studies. And in terms of books, the one that I'm listening to is Obama's new book. And that one's interesting because it starts off obviously walking through the campaign, but then the early part of his presidency was during the 2008-2009 economic downturn, which I was the founder CEO of a company and trying to navigate that. So it was just interesting to hear what was happening behind closed doors from a policy standpoint and its impact on businesses from my perspective.
What's next for you and the now multiple businesses over the next couple of years?
So Wizeline, we want to continue to grow it. And I really do believe we'll be in a position to decide if we want to take it public in 2022. And then, with Wizeline, I think that there's a really interesting opportunity for us to continue to create all of these spinoffs as we identify market opportunities where it makes more sense for there to be a product versus a service. And I think we'll continue to do that. I think that the hardest part in that is, because I'm obviously not running these other businesses, it's finding the entrepreneurs that have the wherewithal that I trust or I believe can take these offshoots all the way, raise capital, manage the business, go through the roller coaster of being an entrepreneur and then eventually turning them into big businesses.
Well, that's the entrepreneur's dream, to be able to get all of your good ideas out and find the right teams and push it. So I hope you're able to do it. It's going to be fun to watch you continue to execute and build the not just the LATAM, but global ecosystem for these startups. Thanks for taking the time to share your story. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Nathan. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Crossing Borders with our guest, Bismarck Lepe. And thank you to Angel Andraca for producing this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with a friend and give us a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's the best way to share what's going on in Latin America's ecosystem.